Hey, this is John. So today I was just interested in talking about the information that's been floating around social media regarding the conclusion that today we would need to make $66 an hour at minimum wage to match the purchasing power in the 1970s ish, right? So I wanted to go through the math with that today and see if there's merit to this claim, and if so, where is the merit, right? Yeah. So, and say if it's true or not, basically. So I did divide this into Canada and the US. I did the numbers for both of those. I did them all manually, like an amateur, in Google Sheets, not in Excel. Anyways, if you do like this video, please like and subscribe. And this week I'm reading The Hunchback of Notre Dame, if you want to read that as well. Okay. Anyways, so basically how I do this, you can see that the calculations or the formulae are on the side here, right? But I start off with the minimum wage in the countries, Canada and US, across the time series 1965 to 1925. One of these values did have to get estimated because there was presumably a change, but the federal minimum wage in this case did not change, national in Canada, but in the provinces it averaged to about 10 and a half. And then some of these too, you'll notice the values are stagnant, and in some cases they don't tell, I think, the best picture of the period, given that, for example, in certain periods like maybe 1995, you might see in 1997 or something, an increase in the minimum wage. Now, aside from that, you will notice that the 2015 is the same value as the 2025 minimum wage in the U.S. That's because I believe the minimum wage in the U.S. has not been updated since 2009, which is certainly not keeping up with inflation, right? Now, so we take the minimum wage, we use the CPI. The CPI is the Consumer Price Index. It basically is a basket of goods, the pricing for a basket of goods that represents a sort of like normal set of purchases. So that would include things like groceries. It does not include rent, at least in some cases. So for example, I think Canada doesn't include mortgage prices. Sorry, includes rent, not mortgage prices. But it does use proxies for mortgage prices or interest payments like rents. Okay, which are probably going to be at least accurate for the time period, though I won't really speculate too much on that today. The CPI is basically calculated, or the value that you see for the CPI is basically calculated by taking the current CPI and dividing that by the base CPI and multiplying that by 100. So obviously then, that means that if the base CPI is lower than the current CPI, then the number will increase, right? And that's, a reflection of inflation. And you can also see where I get the data from. It's not from, I don't know, name some like unreputable crap source. So anyways, then I don't know where the bases are set here, but I think 2000 it looks like for Canada, and something like 1980 for the US. Though you'll also see that down here I did write the base down. Anyways, it's not super important because these are all just relative anyways. Okay, so then I use that to get the real purchasing power, and you can see that this is the nominal income, and the nominal income is basically the actual, like what are people actually getting paid, as you can see here. excluding inflation, and then you multiply that by the effective change in the CPI, or the percent change in the CPI, right? Like base divided by current CPI. I should move this a little bit so you can make sure. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, and then I rebased all of the CPI values to 2025. You can double check the math if you want. Oh, base is 1982, by the way. Anyways, but yeah, rebased to 2025. Okay, anyways. So, what do we get? Well, we see that in 1965, the for example, in Canada, the minimum wage of $1.25 was worth about $12 today. The minimum wage in the U.S. worth about $12.90, right? And these are obviously in their respective currencies, so the CAD and USD, respectively. Then, if we look at, say, 2005, we see that it was worth $10.72 today in Canada. So the $7 in Canada in 2005 worth $10.72. Right, and the $5.15 in the U.S. worth $8.58, right? Okay, and so on. And so then we get this period right here that's sort of interest and such. So we see that really the accounting for everything in the CPI, the actual purchasing power, the real purchasing power of the, and real just means adjusted for inflation, right? Of the sort of like 1970-ish minimum wage is actually worth between like $12 and $15 an hour in Canada, and then something like about $13 an hour in the U.S., right? So that's obviously a big difference between 66 in either of these countries. And maybe another important thing to kind of note as well is that you'll also see that the U.S. Real purchasing power for the minimum wage has been clearly steadily decreasing over time, whereas in Canada it has generally been an upward trend, starting at 12 and going up to 17.75, right, for the real purchasing power of the minimum wage. Again, but this is including all things, right? So, first, and there's lots of things to consider about, well, why might we get these differences? Okay, one is that the items included in the CPI over time have changed, though based on the data, generally this is probably not going to be a big issue, right? We're probably not going to get a significant change in the dollar value of the minimum wage just by, considering the changes in the CPI, given that, somebody else ran an analysis on that and they, so, okay, well, basically, the differences in value might be like a few percentage points. Okay. So, how did people get to the $66 an hour? Well, apparently it's using home prices, right? Exclusively. So, what I did here, and unfortunately it was, I was not able to find the exact pricing for Canada because I was hoping to do the math myself on all of these. Apparently that's not going to happen though for all of them, right? So, but basically the idea was we take the home prices and we take the index and we get the real purchasing power in, more or less the same way. And then I take the minimum wage, and multiply it by the, rebased index, right, to get there. Instead of the home prices for, I do the same thing for, anyways. But for the U.S., though, I calculate the CPI using those home prices directly rather than just, taking from an index. Though the Canadian data is taken from the FRED, as you can see here, for the index, because I couldn't get the home prices for Canada over that time period. Surprisingly, right? I mean, you get it from like, I think this period, maybe even only this period, but whatever. So these are the average home prices in the U.S. These are the index values. And I say, okay, so what do we get for the real purchasing power when we just take the mortgage values into consideration for a CPI? Well, we basically get, so in our most relevant period, we wanted to look at was the 1975s, 1970-ish, is that the purchasing power in Canada was about $40 an hour for the minimum wage. And in the US, it was about 27, if you round up, and 32 in, the 1965s. And then, in 2025, this obviously just dropped considerably. And Canada is slightly up, apparently, from 2015, which I also thought was bizarre, given that the minimum wage, I don't know, homes have just seemed to increase a lot more than the minimum wage in terms of value, right? But maybe it was because, from the 2015 period, somewhere around here, there was a relatively large increase in the minimum wage to, something like pretty much straight from 10 to close to 15 and maybe 14. I guess it's also worth noting as well that inflation isn't driven by increase in minimum wage, but certainly not directly, and it's probably one of the less effective sources of inflation that are out there. Anyways, but I don't want to talk about that today, but I do find it sort of an annoying discussion to have. Okay. So anyways, but yeah, and then obviously though, like in general, the purchasing power is on decline when you consider just the home prices as well, right? But more considerably. So, what is there to take away from this? Well, it seems to me that, and maybe I'm not calculating this in the exact way that whomever had calculated that to get the $66 an hour did. But while the purchasing power of minimum wage worker is clearly significantly decreased, whether you measure it in either fashion in the U.S. and only apparently using home prices in Canada. And in Canada, actually, it is relatively it's better technically. Like the U.S., it looks like it's dropping to about not quite a fourth, but it's like 2/7, I guess I would say, of what it was in 1975. Then in Canada, it's a little under half, right? But anyways, we don't get 66. We do get a significant drop. Why did people get 66? I don't really know. Now, there are problems with just taking the home prices, though. The main one is the exclusion of all of the other factors that go into the CPI. So especially when you consider the difference in prices today versus, say, 1975. So, for example, how expensive were cell phones? How expensive were computers back then? Well, they were significantly more expensive, right? I don't actually know what exactly the prices were, but, it might have been something like, I don't know, like thousands of dollars for a cell phone rather than, hundreds. Additionally, there's also lower interest rates today on mortgages, though generally, though I don't think that would have a huge effect on the data. In contrast to those things that I just listed as, potential problems for removing all other items from the CPI, there is also the consideration that, a lot of technology now has become mandatory and may or may not be less robust than it was in the past, In particular, if you think of automobiles. And so, one, those technologies have become more mandatory, right? Can you really get around effectively without a vehicle? Like some people, try to rationalize, oh yeah, sure, but like not really, right? Not really. And then the second point is that with the, I think almost like a increased proliferation of planned obsolescence into manufacturing processes that have made things more annoying to deal with and more expensive, and you have to buy them more regularly as well. That's also a factor to consider here, right? So does the CPI include, some kind of way of incorporating the changing frequency of purchases or of repairs for things? So for example, on my recent vehicle, I had tried to change the. I noticed basically you can't actually check the transmission fluid yourself anymore on Honda Civics, which I guess must be a relatively new change. But that is annoying because that does mean that every time you want to go and check your transmission fluid, you have to go to the auto dealer instead of, say, just doing it yourself. And that probably also means that it's a much bigger pain in the ass to change. So, anyways, ways of squeezing people have been on the rise. So that's not something that's, I think, factored into the CPI. Mortgage terms have changed a little bit. So depending on which period you look at. So, for example, in the 1965 period, there is a significant difference. But in the 1975 period, they kind of stabilized, right? So, in 1965, we see the average mortgage is about 20 to 25 years long, and then starting at about 1975, it increased to 30 years. We may also see, though, for example, I think Trump had recently introduced a 50-year mortgage plan. Yay! So maybe mortgages will increase in average term as well. Okay. Yeah, and then I also just took a quick look at rental prices and what is this? The differences between the 1965 and 2025 monthly rentals. You see that there's about the same change, right? So if we look at, say, the home prices in the U.S., they went through about a 26-fold change, and then in Canada, the rental prices went through about a 26-fold change, and then in the U.S., about a 22-fold change. So there might be some other questions that are worth asking as well, in addition to looking at this, to answer questions about affordability. One might be the differences or changes in disposable income and debt over time, right? Do people have more or less money left over at the end of the month to spend on goods that they want, like entertainment or whatever? Are the changes to the CPI potentially questionable? And looking into them in more detail, again, probably not. There are reasonably sophisticated people looking at that information and making those decisions. And there's also, and people have looked at, how much of the changes actually changed over time. Not much. Okay. And potentially are the proxies, so are rental prices actually a good proxy, for example? Maybe also, too, is there enough weight put on the changes in home prices in the CPI? Because it is increasing in the percentage of income that people earn spent on rent is increasing over time, and also more people are renting over time, which is also going to push up the rental market, right? So that will probably become a bigger problem. Well, everything becomes a bigger problem, of course, when your economy is functioning on we buy stuff that people need and the prices increase, and we're also gonna simultaneously sort of like restrict the production of those things to keep the prices high. Yeah, of course the problem's gonna get worse, right? So anyways, clearly big differences in the purchasing power, in particular in the US. Still some other questions to ask about the data, and it's not apparently like even half of $66 an hour, but it is still a pretty big difference, right? Okay, anyways. All right, that's the end of the video. Take care.